Welcome, everyone. Hello, hello. If you're here for the webinar titled, What's Next on a Planet of 8 Billion, here from Global Youth, you are in the right place. We're going to give it a minute to get started. I can see folks are still popping into the virtual room here. So we'll give it one more minute. Thank you for your patience, and then we will start. If anyone is having problems, you can join by phone. We're putting some of that in the chat now. Always an option for you. And if you are having any tech issues, you can use the Q&A function, and Fabi on our end will help you maneuver any kind of tech or issues that you're having on that end. All right. Well, I think I'm going to get started with my formal introduction, which will give us a few more minutes here for any stragglers. But hello, and thank you for attending today's discussion. Before we officially get started, I'll go over a little bit of housekeeping. Everyone is muted, as we do have a large group today, and this event is being recorded, and we're going to share it out afterwards in our respective newsletters. The chat's been disabled, and it can sometimes be distracting to others, but we will be sharing resources with you throughout it, similar to the stuff we're doing right now with the tech issues. So we ask that you submit questions for the panelists using the Q&A function. And then just for an agenda, after introductions, there'll be a few short presentations, and we're going to open it up for Q&A. We will be able to see who submits questions, but we're going to respond to them anonymously. And we hope you'll ask questions even if you're not sure how to phrase it, and we'll do our best to answer them as long as they're respectful. We will work to get to as many of your questions answered as time will allow. And I'm going to start us off with a quick introduction. All right, next slide, Suzanne. So my name's Kelly Dennings, and my pronouns are she and her. For those that are unable to see me today, I'm a petite, also could say short, white, middle-aged woman with short brown hair standing in my office. So you're not going to hear much from me after this introduction because this is about youth. I want to acknowledge that I'm on stolen, Seminole, Timucua, and Muscogee land where many individuals face displacement and suffering and hope one day they receive restorative measures. I spent 15 years working in waste, forestry, and conservation before getting a master's in public health, and I'm a campaigner with the Center for Biological Diversity, working to develop and execute campaigns that address the connections between reproductive health, gender equity, endless growth, and the climate and extinction crises, which you're going to hear a lot about today. Next slide. So first, just a quick introduction about the center. We're a national nonprofit conservation organization that works through a combination of science, the law, activism, and creative media to protect wildlife and the wild places they need to thrive. On the screen, you're seeing all of our different programs, and you very well may be currently involved with us, so thank you. Our philosophy is a win-win-win situation that empowers people, improves resilience and health outcomes, and reduces pressure on wildlife and the environment. When we talk about population pressure, we take a human rights lens, and it's done with justice and equity in mind. Now, to set the stage for today's conversation, we are living in a world of 8 billion people, right? We just turned that in November. And today's youth face climate disruption, threats to reproductive rights, and the overconsumption of resources, among many other challenges. So we're excited to be partnering today with Transition Earth to hear directly from young people from all over the globe about their biggest concerns and the individual and systemic solutions they're advocating for. While their remarks may not tie directly to the conservation of wildlife habitat, the solutions they're recommending support people and the planet, address the extinction and climate crises, and move us away from endless growth. Next slide, Suzanne. So before we get started, we're going to have a little poll, and hopefully Fabiola will help us, pop that up. So we want to just know, it will help us tailor our remarks, but are you with academia, a community organizer, an interested citizen, nonprofit, staff, student, or other? And while we had hoped that this might be multiple choice because we can wear multiple identities, pick the identity that you most closely align with. And then we will continue on once Fabi shares the results when she thinks enough folks have responded. Let's see. Interested citizen. All right. Love it. Love it. Thank you all so much for taking our poll. Next slide. All right. So it is my honor to introduce your moderator for today's webinar, Joshua Mirando. He is a project associate with Transition Earth based in Uganda. He's also a communications specialist and photographer with a bachelor's degree in public administration and management. Joshua wanted to work in sexual and reproductive health field after interacting with teenage commercial sex workers in Kampala and seeing firsthand their reproductive health needs. Since then, he has always had the desire to ensure that he uses all avenues to disseminate age-appropriate reproductive health information so that younger people learn how to make informed decisions. Over to you, Josh. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much, Kelly, for that awesome introduction. You just made me feel good about myself by introducing me like that. Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much, participants, for joining our webinar. And before we go any further, I want to thank Center for Biological Diversity for partnering with us and ensuring that this webinar is a success. I'll just give a brief introduction about Transition Earth, and we work to increase awareness of the effects of population growth and unsustainable resources on, unsustainable resource use or on people and the planet, and to ensure that there are successful solutions to protecting the environment, recognizing that nature has rights and humans are part of the web life. We also empower people to make the best decisions for themselves and their families. So we work also to foster youth education and activism on issues of population growth, human rights, and the environment, and not forgetting advocating for the rights of women and girls. And by this, we address the need for voluntary family planning, raising awareness on the links between gender and climate, and promoting the population health environment development model. Yeah. So today we have a list of panelists. Some of you who are able to see the posters, we have a list of panelists, and these are youth, and we trust that they will be able to dissect all these issues, because we have people from different fields, and but all of them, each field that the people that we have on this platform contributes to the 8 billion mark. So we will be having another call, and we would like to get a feel of your current understanding of some of the solutions we plan to discuss today. So please vote on the poll as we proceed.
And again, this poll is just a single choice answer. So maybe tell us which one you're the most familiar with.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Seems most of the people are familiar with our population health and environment, but we do not have anyone who is familiar with the reuse models. We have people, 11% of the participants attending the webinar are familiar with climate change just transition. Then we have a few of them who 4% of them have an idea or two about comprehensive sexuality education and sexual and reproductive rights. Thank you so much. I'm glad that you guys have highlighted on what you are familiar with most, but trust me, we have the best people to address these issues. And by the end of this webinar, believe me, you have all the knowledge that you need about this. So I'm excited to introduce our first two speakers. Abigail, one of them is called Abigail. Abigail is a development professional working for impact-driven sustainable development initiatives in line with global goals. She holds a master's degree in international development from Paris School of International Affairs. Yeah, if you have any francophones on this, some of them pronounce that as Paris, but some Anglophone now pronounce that Paris. Pronounce that Paris School of International Affairs Sciences. She also has a bachelor's degree in French and linguistics from the University of Ghana. Her work and interests span communications, youth advocacy, capacity development, women and girls' rights, including their empowerment and reproductive health, as well as project management for sustainable development. She has had multicultural, impact-oriented professional engagements at United Nations Population Fund, that is UNFPA in Ghana, and the Unleashed Secretariat in Copenhagen, Denmark. Abigail is an alumnus of cohort 1 of the Youth Leaders Fellowship program of the UN and a yearly fellow. Another speaker, another panelist is Naa-Amy, who is a public health and development professional who has worked with several public health and society organizations, including the UNFPA, MasterCard Foundation, Planned Parenthood Association of Ghana. At these organizations, she has supported projects focused on sexual and reproductive health, youth development, and HIV programming. Wayne works directly with underserved communities through the FHL group, a personal NGO initiative of hers, and it also provides information and services, including vulnerable groups facilitated by strategic partnerships and innovative and high-based approaches. He is a scholar under the Georgia AHEC Scholars Program and is currently pursuing a master's in public health, health policy and management. She is an alumnus of UNFPA Yola Fellowship and a yearly fellow. Next slide, Suzanne. Yeah, so please, Abby and Wayne, take it from there. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. It's so great to be here today. My name is Abigail, but I prefer to be called Abby. Together with my colleague, Naa-Amy, we'll be sharing our thoughts on how sexual and reproductive health and rights are impacted by the climate crisis from our perspectives as African young people, based on our experiences and our knowledge. For those of you who cannot see me, I am dark-skinned with short curly black hair, which are currently in Swiss Alps, and I'm about 5'3". Next slide. Okay, so here's an overview of the points I will address in this presentation. We'll first expound on the topic of SRHR and then explain why it is important to young people in general, but more specifically to adolescent girls. And then we'll talk about how this topic links to climate change and the climate crisis. Then we'll share some ideas about what we believe can be done to make the climate SRHR nexus more prominent in discourse and action. Next slide. So as Joss has already outlined, Naa and I are both Ghanaian young women. We recently moved to the diaspora, France and the US specifically for school and work. A few years back, we worked together at the UNFPA in Ghana within the the framework of the Youth Leaders Fellowship Program. It was a professional development program. Our work mainly focused on programming and execution of initiatives to provide access to information and services for adolescent sexual and reproductive health and rights, as well as gender equality and equity issues. Over to you now.
Okay, hello everyone. So for those of you who cannot see me, I'm dark-skinned with dark brown eyes, and I have black hair, but currently in box braids with red tips. Yes. All right. So just as Abigail said, I'm Naa, and I work with her at UNFPA. I also founded a social enterprise by name Faith, Hope, and Love Group. And what we do is we work directly with women and girls in underserved communities, pushing for improved access to reproductive health services, such an uptake of family planning services, including capacity building for young people. We have reached about 8,000 people and still counting. And it's a pleasure to speak to you all. Over to you, Abby.
Thank you, Naa. Next slide, please. So we're just going to dive right in. When you talk of good SRHR, it refers to a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being and everything that has to do with the reproductive system. And ideally, SRHR is viewed with a life cycle approach where SRHR needs are different at every stage and as such need to be addressed accordingly. Good sexual reproductive health and rights implies that people are able to have a satisfying and safe sex life and the capability to reproduce, the freedom to decide if, when, and how often to do so. In order to have good SRHR, people need firstly access to accurate information about safe, effective, and affordable contraceptive methods of their choice. They need to be empowered to protect themselves from sexually transmitted infections, and they also need access to skilled healthcare providers and services to help them through pregnancy, safe birth, and postnatal stage of reproduction. Now, all of this is a rights-based issue, and so every individual has the right to make their own choices about their sexual and reproductive health. Next slide. Okay, so as can be inferred from the name, SRHR has various components. There's sexual health that implies physical, mental, social well-being, everything relating to one's sexuality, and it includes safety from sexual illness and sexual violence. Then there's sexual rights, which imply the ability to decide on one's own sexuality, including decisions about partner, privacy, reproduction, and so on. Then there's reproductive health, which is the ability and the willingness to reproduce and to determine how often and with whom. Then there's reproductive rights that refer to the right to decide if and when to have children. Next slide. Now we'll talk a little bit about the nexus between climate change and SRHR. Climate change, as you all probably know, is a change in weather patterns as a result of global warming. We can already see the impact of climate change all around us. Hotter temperatures, more frequent and intense storms, rising sea levels, droughts, food shortages, poverty, displacement, and so on. These implications disproportionately affect vulnerable groups and geographies. These groups include women, girls, and young people in general, and affect regions in the global south that often do not have the adequate resources and infrastructure for climate adaptation. For example, insufficient rainfall in the Horn of Africa due to warmer temperatures has resulted in widespread drought and food shortages, affecting the quality of life of already vulnerable communities, which by extension have negative implications on access to reproductive health information and services. Next slide. Now, in line with our experience and scope of work at FHL, we want to narrow in on adolescent sexual and reproductive health. So adolescent girls in regions of the global south are particularly vulnerable to issues regarding their SRHR. Factors like cultural and religious resistance to comprehensive sexuality education, misconceptions about family planning, and the dearth of policies and resources allocated to SRHR impact their ability to positively engage with access and services. As can be seen from the statistics here on the slide, these global south regions face a high incidence of adolescent pregnancies, and it is estimated that if all family planning needs are met in these regions, 7.4 million adolescent pregnancies will be avoided every year. Now, what climate change related crises do to these regions is to exacerbate the already lacking efforts to bridge the existing gaps in adolescent SRHR. So now I'll hand over to Naa to elaborate more on this nexus.
Okay, thank you, Abby. Next slide, please. So just as Abigail has stated, the impacts of climate change on health are already evident, and they include direct and indirect impact on the reproductive health of young people. I would like us to view this from an affect and effect approach. So looking at the effect of climate change on sexual health and rights, We know that climate change issues are not gender neutral, but there remains evolving evidence of a heightened threat to the health and rights of girls and women. So within the systems that are usually working, climate-related disasters place a strain on health systems and hamper access to reproductive health services. So for hard-to-reach communities with limited access to facilities, women must travel a median of about 3.5 miles to the nearest health facility, which is that for pregnant women in labor. So imagine the only route to safe delivery being physically obstructed by climate-related disaster. Doesn't sound too good, exactly. And when we look at climate change, it can be devastating to maternal health. For example, dehydration and food shortages resulting from drought has that implication for pregnant women. Also in northern Ghana and across the sub-Saharan region, families are more susceptible to gift their adolescent girls in marriage for economic gain or resources during scarce economic conditions caused by climate change. Young girls under 15 who get pregnant are also more susceptible to pregnancy-related complications such as placental tears and obstruction during delivery. There's also significant evidence linking climate-related disasters to increased vulnerability to gender-based violence when we look at sexual violence and transactional sex for economic gain, which in turn leads to an increase in STIs and unintended pregnancies. We have to know that many factors that inhibit the realization of SRHR also exacerbate vulnerability to climate change and vice versa. So it's important to approach the climate and SRH work with an intersectional lens. So next slide, please. We'll now look at how reproductive health affects climate change. So during a natural or man-made crisis, there's typically a breakdown of support systems and services that impact girls and women more directly, and especially in humanitarian settings when it comes to their reproductive health services. There's yet to be a lot of conversation, on the nexus between SRHR and climate change in the African sub-region, especially because efforts currently are more focused towards targeting other direct impact factors that affect access to SRHR services and quality of care. There's also limited information on the effect of climate change on SRHR for young people in Africa, which brings the need for more understanding and recognition of the issue. This actually results in limited adaptation efforts and a need for more attention and resource allocations towards addressing climate impacts on the SRHR of young people in Africa. We must know that even with a high population and fertility rate, Africa remains one of the low carbon emitting regions. So it's important that we recognize that we believe that increased access to and uptake of family planning among young people can encourage smaller families and in turn slow population growth, which potentially also has the effect of reducing carbon emissions. And then to also effectively adapt to climate change while addressing gender equality and access to reproductive health, we will need to focus also on alleviating period poverty, which is a big issue in Africa. And this involves increasing access to sustainable period products as against the prevalent single-use products, the pad most of us use. And an initiative of us at FHL is the Pad a Girl program, where we look at providing period products to adolescent girls in underserved communities. And we also raise awareness on sustainable period products through our awareness creation programs. We'll show you a couple of them in our next few slides with some pictures. Can we move on to the next slide, please? We will ask ourselves what we can do. So an innovative approach towards addressing the issue of climate change is important. Looking at its impact on SRH of young people in Africa. It will call for us to involve combining social marketing principles with education and awareness campaigns. Like I said, we have also tried as FHL different projects, and one project is the Community Canvas project. With this project, we use art to address social norms and existing barriers to gain community buy-in and encourage the uptake of reproductive health services, particularly family planning among young people. There's also the need for increased cooperation between communities. Here we're talking about communities advocating for women's health, rights, and climate change. And this can actually help promote climate action when we leverage on our collective strengths and resources. So we've also seen as an organization that working with national and grassroots organizations helps us contextualize our approach to engage with leaders, specifically traditional leaders. And this has also helped us get to hard to reach communities and populations, ensuring that no one is left behind in our efforts. Also, there's also the important to note that we need to invest in strengthening our health systems, and this can help in addressing the issue such that we invest in different modes of service delivery. The use of mobile or pop-up clinics in underserved communities has helped bring a paradigm shift in addressing the accessibility gap for SRH information and services. Increased financial support and investment in research and climate adaptation will also help in the SRH approach when we look at addressing SRHR and climate change, as well as a gender transformative approach, looking at inclusivity. Can we move on to the next slide? In this next slide, we see on the upper left corner, like I mentioned, the Community Canvas project, where we're using arts in community to address the issue of reproductive health. Here we have community buy-in. We even had some community members joining us to do this. So there was a spark conversation. And then also there's a pop-up clinic where we also host pop-up clinics in communities. This is one picture from a pop-up clinic we had in the slum community just recently. And at the lower section is some pictures from our awareness creation programs where we create awareness on proper menstrual health and period products. You can see the menstrual cup on the lower right section. Yes. So we just like to end with saying that as young people, we need to take action, start conversations in person, social media, take up leadership positions as well, and speak on the issues that directly affect us. We can also be more intentional in our daily lives by being aware of reducing our carbon footprint. It can be, and probably for us females, as a sustainable approach in utilizing reproductive health products and services. Yes, so thank you all, and over to you, Josh.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was an awesome presentation from Abby and Naa-Amy. Yeah, you've highlighted quite a number of the programs that you guys are doing and the tremendous work that you guys are doing. And I'm asking our participants, our attendees, please, in case you have any question that you would want Naa-Amy and Abigail to address, please drop it in the comment section. We're going to curate them and make sure that we respond all of them. Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. That was really, really nice. And I was all paying attention, and I didn't want you guys to stop. But we have to go on with the program, and we will be having our next speaker. Our next speaker is called Laura. Yeah, and I met Laura last year when we were in Thailand for the international international conference on family planning, and she was really doing some tremendous work during her submissions. And yeah, but let me not talk a lot. She will highlight on that. Let me just give a brief introduction about her, and she'll tell the rest of it since she understands better. And according to the polls that we held, we saw that there was a gap in the kind of information that she's going to give. So please pay attention. Who is Laura? Laura Ramos Tomás is a European sexuality educator based in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. She has worked across Latin America and at the intersection of poverty, lack of access to education, and social equality for 5 years, working with organizations that support survivors of trafficking, sex workers, and youth, and young mothers living in social vulnerability. In 2020, Laura launched TabuTabu, an organization on a mission to normalize healthy dialogue about sex and sexuality for people of all walks of life. TabuTabu's impacts initiatives co-create contextually relevant sexuality education programs with underserved communities in Brazil and Honduras that center sex and pleasure positivity. Yeah, please, Laura, take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josh. Hello, everyone. So as Josh said, my name is Laura. My pronouns are she, her. And for those of you who can't see me, I am a white woman. I have light brown hair, and today it is in a top bun. I have black and orange glasses. I'm wearing a mango yellow t-shirt, and I tend to smile a lot when I talk, so you might hear that in my voice. So before we get started on the link between sexuality education and climate, I thought I'd share a little bit about my background and the lenses with which I joined this discussion today, because I think that's relevant to I think our call to action overall. So a bit about me. I was born and raised in Germany, but my family is from Spain. And so I spent 17 years across both of those countries. And I then moved to the UK to study. And I then worked in the UK for 5 years. And eventually I moved to Latin America 6 years ago. So like Josh said, I'm based in Brazil right now, but I've lived and worked across the region. And I acknowledge the privilege that comes with having that flexibility of being able to move from one place to another and to kind of compare those experiences and the cultures and the people. And so what have I learned? And especially what have I learned in terms of sexuality education? Next slide, please. Oh, we are stuck. So as we are overcoming, there we go. What I've learned is that taboos around sexuality tend to transcend social class and geography. So what do I mean by that? I mean that when I have conversations about sex and sexuality in Europe, they're actually not so different to the conversations I may have around sex and sexuality in Latin America. So it's less about the focus of what conversations we're having, and it's more about focusing on having them, on actually creating the spaces in a way that is contextually relevant to the people, that is that's framed within their realities so that everybody feels comfortable enough to have them, and then be able to explore these aspects of sexuality together. Next slide, please. So what does that mean when we talk about contextually relevant even further? So here's an image of, on the left-hand side, the locations that, or what it looks like in the locations that I currently work in. So what we see is some clothes hanging on a clothesline that are on the side of a structure that's been put together by different pieces of wood. Some of them look like scrap wood, and a little bit of a metal shed top to the structure. And on the other side of the screen is a very modern building, very developed. It's also a different kind of photograph, probably a professional photograph. And that's actually the location where I learned about sex education. So on one hand, I'm comparing where I'm currently working versus where I have been and where I learned. And so although these contexts and these realities look very different, the taboos around sex are very similar. The taboos being all the conversations that we are too scared to have, we think are awkward, we're going to start wanting to run out the door, and we're overall not really equipped to have, because sex is such a loaded topic for many of our cultures. And so, like I said, the focus is really bringing access to spaces where we can have these conversations, and then therefore the information that can be shared in these spaces, and ultimately acknowledging that we are all human, regardless of the realities that we live in and the struggles that we face. Being human kind of connects us all. And so in that context, we will have to make decisions about sex and sexuality. And the more informed and the more access we have to information, the better equipped we will be to have that. And that's really where sex education, therefore, comes in. Next slide, please. So this following slide includes the benefits of comprehensive sexuality education. It's not a slide I'm going to go into a lot of detail about, because it's more just for reference for you to have. There tends to be a lot of pushback when we talk about comprehensive sexuality education. And so firstly, I'm just going to recap what that is, given the poll that we had at the beginning. That it may be a term that you might have heard but not been so familiar with. And so comprehensive sexuality education essentially is, yes, talking about sex and educating about sex, but in a way that is very holistic. So in a lot of contexts where they say that they offer sexuality education, it tends to be focused on the biology of sex, so the body parts and how they fit together and how we make babies, and also how to avoid pregnancy, how to avoid disease. And the narrative is very kind of medical, and it tends to be very limited to the biology. And comprehensive sexuality education takes a step back and actually looks at sexuality as a holistic life experience. And so sexuality is far more than just the act of sex and the act of penetration and all of that. It looks at things like gender. It looks at gender-based violence. It looks at, pleasure and how to have pleasurable, healthy relationships. Yes, of course, it looks at contraception as well, but really it's like this whole interconnected aspect that connects to other areas of our life. And that's exactly where we get to talking about climate. Next slide, please. So when we think about how sex education and how comprehensive sexuality education can link to climate, there's probably a lot of connections that can be made, but I'm going to be bringing 3 specific ones to you in this presentation today. Next slide, please. So the first one is what one could call eco-friendly sex and what is involved within eco-friendly sex. So really it's linking sexual activity to the environment. And this is something that in an educational setting, in a classroom or in a workshop with youth and even with adults is actually really tangible. It's very easy to understand. It's everything from the clothes that you're wearing whilst you or before you engage in sexual activity. What are they made from? How are they made? Are they made sustainably? Are they made by people who have, access to workers' rights and all of that? The bed sheets that you're working on or that you're eventually going to maybe end up on, are they environmentally friendly? Are they biodegradable? How have they been produced? What inks have they produced? All of that context. But also, how do you engage in sexual activity? Are you having sex in the shower? Are you having sex in the shower with running water? How much water are you wasting? Are you leaving the lights on or off? If you use vibrators, is your vibrator, does it use rechargeable batteries? Is it solar powered? Are you using lubricant? How does that involve the environment? And is it, does it damage the water when you're washing it off and things like that? It also affects menstrual health, which is also a topic related to sexuality education. So are you using disposable menstrual health products, tampons, pads, or are you using reusable ones, as we just heard in the previous presentation? And it also involves contraception. When you use a condom, you're creating waste. So the objective here with these conversations and this link to climate, I'm going to make this very clear, is not to highlight that we should not be using condoms and not creating waste. Okay, that is not the message. The message is about what waste is worth producing. So being aware of the waste that you're producing and the decisions that you're making. How are you going about making these decisions so that you can live your sexual life the way you want to, and hopefully responsibly, but also with the awareness of what impact you're having in the wider planet. I think overall, one could argue that safe sex is always going to be more sustainable in the long run. But I think it's really important to have that lens of what waste are you producing. And that leads me to my second point. Next slide, please. So the second point looks at this aspect of consciousness, of being aware of what you're doing, what you want to do with your life, the projection that you have. And that really involves family planning. And I would argue that family planning is not the best term because youth that are potentially sexually active are not necessarily sexually active because they're planning a family. They're sexually active because they're exploring pleasure, because they're exploring connection, because they're curious, they want to understand themselves more and each other more. But anyway, this concept of family planning is, when do you choose to have children and how are you going to act if you choose to have children until that moment? And so this really involves agency and body autonomy, which are like comprehensive sexuality education 101 topics. Everything from consent, which is interpersonal, but also like agency and autonomy over oneself and one's own decisions is very important. And so when we have information and we have spaces to explore that information, then we can make decisions and kind of see how it all pans out. And then once we've had that process, that thought process, when we're then outside of the learning space in a situation where we need to make a decision, we are more equipped to make that decision. And ultimately, the objective is to ensure, in a grand scheme of things and in an ideal world, that all births that happen are actually wanted and all pregnancies that happen are wanted. And so that's part of the comprehensive sexuality education conversation. And my third point is even, wider scale than that. And it's talking about, yes, gender equity, as we've discussed, but I would actually argue all equity. So things like climate change, like the rate of population increase and all of these, we can't have these conversations if not everybody is involved. And that kind of brings me back to what I was doing at the beginning of acknowledging my differences to the cultures and the communities that I work in. I'm European and I'm working in Latin America. I'm a white woman and I work with non-white youth, predominantly Black youth. I also work with Black women. And so my experience in sexuality is very different to theirs for a number of reasons. And we need to acknowledge that there is a lot to be said for that diversity. And we know that climate, for example, affects the most vulnerable. And we need to make sure that everybody is in on the conversation about how we're gonna overcome these issues and how we're going to change the narrative in our behavior. So the question really is who gets a seat at the table, but also who's not even in the room, who's not even reaching the table, because that's who we need to be bringing in. And that goes from all things gender and sexual orientation and gender identity, but it goes beyond that to who's able-bodied and who's bringing in a perspective of disability, of neurodivergence. We need these conversations at the table if we're going to achieve a solution that really does benefit everybody. So those are my three kind of links to sexuality education. I will leave it at that. Next slide, please. Just a little thank you slide, and we'll be around for the Q&A in a bit. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Laura. I had you pronounce it as Laura. Yeah, I know we come from different areas and have different pronunciations of our names. So, yeah, I think, thank you, Adoma, for posting the link to TabuTabu in the chat box. Please, if you want to know more about Laura or Laura, please check in the chat box. You will see a lot more that she does, more than what she has talked about. And I'm glad that she has been able to break down, sexuality, sexuality education, sex education, and what is pleasure positivity and things like that. And the fact that she has worked in different areas, I think she has tried to put together what she has been experiencing in the different communities that she has worked for. She has worked in like the diversity. Yeah. So our final speaker is Adoma. Adoma, I don't know if pronunciation of the other name is quite hard. I don't know if it's Ado or Ado, but she will tell us the right pronunciation since she is around. So she is an associate at Center for Biological Diversity, where she supports campaigns centered around addressing human impacts on the environment. At the center, Adoma's work focuses on waste communications, advocacy for sexual reproductive health and rights, and the systematic injustices associated with equal environment burdens and unequal access to health services. Adoma holds a bachelor's degree in environmental studies and global health from Yale University. So Adoma, the floor is yours, please. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Josh. As you mentioned, my name is Adoma Ado. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm currently speaking to you from Quinnipiac land in Southern Connecticut. For those of you who are unable to see me, I'm a Black woman with shoulder-length black hair, wearing a white shirt, and I have some nice gold earrings on. I'm going to switch it up a little bit and talk more about consumption. We've talked a lot about reproductive health and SRHR, but I'm going to talk a little bit about consumption and the role that youth play in creating lasting, conscious decisions in how we consume, really building off of a lot of the center's work in my own experience as a young person. Next slide, please. Right, so before I go into a larger discussion of consumption, I wanted to really contextualize the relationship between reproductive health and consumption and why those topics really go hand in hand. So a recurring theme throughout this presentation has been the ways in which the larger systems of inequality and injustice create disproportionate levels of access to the complete range of reproductive health care. Reproductive health specifically is often affected by poor environmental quality. That makes it difficult for both parents and children to thrive in safe and healthy communities. And improving environmental conditions, tangentially, is transforming unjust systems of production and transforming the way we consume are really crucial components to cultivating positive public health outcomes and are really imperative for reproductive justice. On the slide, you can see two key definitions of these important concepts, including reproductive health, environmental justice. And while unfortunately, I won't have time to go in depth into these exact links in this presentation, feel free to use the QR code on the right side of the screen to check out our environmental health and reproductive health report. I'm still going to go over a couple of concepts in the report on the next few slides, but yeah, next slide, please. So the larger systems of production and consumption have really clear and well-documented impacts on the environment and human health. Environmental harm, as many of you may know, as was mentioned by many of our presenters before, can be caused through numerous processes including industrial agriculture, plastic pollution, fossil fuel extraction, as well as the overall impacts of a changing climate, contributing to increasing waste, the loss of biodiversity and keystone species, land transformation and disruptions of ecosystems, as well as pollution and increasing carbon emissions. These environmental harms can really cause challenging birth and pregnancy outcomes, including infertility, low sperm counts, interruptions in menstrual cycles, and high-risk pregnancies. And so we see cycles of harm where consumption influences human health, but also human health is really influenced by larger patterns of consumption. The issues listed here are fundamentally related to how we consume on a systemic level, and many of these health burdens are not equally distributed within society. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, perfect. So as I sort of have alluded to, inequality and injustice in extractive industries such as plastic production and fossil fuel extraction produce cycles of disproportionate harms from housing to labor to the products that we use. And this slide includes a couple of examples, including factory and industrial workers being at a high risk of harm from environmental exposures, which is often aggregated by limited worker health benefits and low wages. In the United States in particular, nearly half of all housing projects are located near factories that emit toxins. Water insecurity is a global issue, but can also make certain communities dependent on plastic water bottles. Additionally, the global export and import of e-waste can present many health and environmental burdens, specifically with respect to heavy metal contamination, and most notably in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. Fundamentally, these ubiquitous and multi-sectoral impacts of exploitation and oppression exist under a larger system of racialized capitalism and unfair patterns of consumption. Next slide, please. I want to acknowledge here that consumption is a huge topic that really touches on a variety of different areas that I won't have time to get to, including food production, waste management, the clothes we wear, the products we buy, technology, and all of its life cycles. I would really love to go into all of these, but I have 10 minutes, as you all know. I'm happy to answer some of the questions later in the Q&A, but we can first acknowledge that we live in a composite of systems that are fundamentally centered around our need to consume more, extracting resources from the earth, and often at the expense of marginalized people. On a fundamental level, we do need to consume. However, the larger geopolitical context demands a reconsideration of how much we consume, what we consume, and recognizing the impacts of that consumption are not always equal. If you look on the slide, you can see a slightly blurry graph. My apologies, but it essentially says that The US is 5% of the world's population, but uses around 30% of all resources, creates 30% of all waste, and emits 15% of the world's total carbon emissions. The average American has an environmental impact 60% larger than most Europeans and nearly 700% larger than the average person in most African countries. As populations continue to grow in high consumption nations like the US, we can expect these consumption patterns to continue to worsen, ultimately contributing to our current biodiversity and extinction crises. This is particularly important to me as someone who was born in the US, but grew up predominantly in Western and Southern Africa. I wanted to really comment on how this really demonstrates the importance of considering context when we talk about consumption. I want to acknowledge that talking about asking people to consume less in certain contexts is not always an equitable request. The center often considers this in relation to conscious consumption, but that only works when there's an element of transparency. Some people do need to consume less, some people need to consume differently, and some folks, even in the US, need to consume more. And that's often in relation to food, clothing, or shelter, or even things that bring people joy. Now that we've thought about consumption, its impacts on a global scale, I wanted to go a little bit more in depth into consumption and context. In the next two slides, we'll really demonstrate the importance of considering context and demand that we consider both systems that create health and human harm and the individual actions involved. Next slide, please. Another blurry picture, my apologies, but this is a picture that is more personal to me. A family friend took it for my thesis, and it really depicts a gutter cleaning by a group of young men in urban Ghana. And in my understanding, this represents some of the systemic shortcomings in dealing with the byproducts of consumption and how it can create additional health risks. In this picture, we can see there's a pretty clear inaccessibility of formal waste management. There's generally poor regulation of waste management systems, predominantly in lower income communities. And there's generally an absence of affordable alternatives, really resulting in a systemic dependence on plastic bottles of water, as you can see in the picture. It also reflects how systems influence behavior. We can see the dependence on plastic water bottles as a necessity for water access. And also how the absence of accessible waste management services can often encourage people to discard of their waste in gutters and places where they can't actually be properly processed. Next slide, please. On the other hand, something that's a little closer to me currently, we have here in the United States, fast fashion trends, which really dominate the global north, and how young people can really get involved in these haul videos and the trends of fast fashion. Many of the clothes that we see that come from fast fashion retailers, with the most notorious, of course, being Shein, can really provide a variety of human health, social, and environmental concerns. Shein in particular is an online-only fast fashion group, which is worth over $100 billion, and it has a pretty lengthy list of human rights abuses, copyright infringement cases, heavy metal contamination, and generally a lot of environmental concerns with respect to textile waste and greenhouse gas production. As you can see sort of on the bottom of the slide, there's an image from a Shein factory in which people from the same age group as the people in the top are essentially being forced to work up to 14 hours a day. So contrasting these two images, it's really clear that the impacts of consumption can sometimes not always be felt by the consumers. In higher income nations like the US, young people might be buffered from the direct impacts of sustainable consumption, while young people, both in the US and globally, can be more directly harmed by it. Next slide, please. It isn't, however, all doom and gloom. We aren't blind to the impact of consumption. Our research from a 2019 survey, which we're currently in the midst of updating, found that 3 out of 4 people surveyed in the United States actually think that the American consumers consume too many natural resources, reflecting a growing understanding of the impact of our consumption behaviors on resources in the environment at large. Next slide. And young people are really leading the way in this conscious consumption movement. Really recognizing how changing our consumption habits can have a real impact on the environment. there's been growing trends in considering sustainable products, secondhand shopping, and of course, the well-known considering plant-based diets. Trying to, next slide, please. Realize we only have a couple minutes, so I'm trying to get through this. And recognizing this growing willingness, but also acknowledging that we have a lot to change in terms of our consumption habits. There are several individual actions and systemic mobilizations that could be implemented to continue to propel these positive changes forward. Starting out with the systemic level, primarily considering the role of businesses and government, we can advocate for greater transparency in working conditions and production processes, along with more stringent labor laws globally, more permissive reuse and repair, continued investment in food and social justice, and really transitioning away from historically harmful factory production processes. On the individual level, we can also make changes towards more efficient personal consumption, encouraging behaviors that involve greater research into environmental, social, and the health practices of production, learning and investing in products that can be reused, reworn, or repaired, as well as really focusing on plant-forward and earth-friendly diets in a way that is culturally inclusive and accessible. Next slide, please, my last slide. These individual transformations are really just one part of the larger effort to transform how we consume and the systems that drive us to consume. Differences in context and recognizing context and resources, and resource access require commitment to pluralism, recognizing that there's no one single solution to the issue of consumption, but numerous piecemeal solutions on the individual level. And if you are interested in learning a little bit more about the Centers of Work around Consumption, please check out our resource slide at the very end. But thank you very much. That's about it from me. Yep, and there's our two links: Take Extinction Off Your Plate, and then our Simplify the Holidays page.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Adoma. I think just like what you did for the rest, please insert the link for Central Biodiversity in the chat box, so they can be able to access much more than what we've talked about. But it was an awesome presentation, and the fact that it was more like bridging the gap that had been created by the earlier speakers who are entirely speaking about sexual and reproductive health, and then you've brought in biodiversity, you've brought in environment. I think right now the attendees have a clear picture of what we intended them to have as we were brainstorming about this webinar. So yeah, I want to thank all the speakers for the wonderful presentations that have been made. You guys were really thoughtful, and you took your time to prepare, and at least we have had a clear picture of what everyone does and how what we need to do as young people towards the 8 billion mark that was reached last year in November. I think it was around 15th November. So you guys have painted a picture of what's next for us, and without wasting any time, I want us to dive into the Q&A. There's some people who have been asking some questions in the chat box, and the first questions are going to Abigail and Naa-Amy. The first question was, how have the communities responded to FHL pop-up clinics and other activities? I'll ask again, how have the communities responded to the FHL pop-up clinics and other activities? The second question that is going to Abigail and Naa-Amy, I think you guys can divide yourselves and see who answers which question, since there are two. The second question is, how can we get involved in the work on the ground? How can we get involved in the work on the ground? Yes, back to you, Abigail and Naa-Amy.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Josh. And Thank you for the question. So we've actually had very positive feedback from the communities. And I must say that in Ghana and probably by extension Africa, there is some stigma or some misconceptions associated with family planning and reproductive health. There was a lot of backlash when we even introduced comprehensive sexuality education in Ghana. It was a major backlash. But we actually do have a good number of people showing up doing our pop-up clinics, a minimum of 100 people, give or take, which I think is a decent number. The pop-up clinics afford us direct engagement with communities. One, where our health personnel are able to address certain misconceptions. They refer cases when they need to be referred. There was this one, there was an occasion where we had a young girl, about 18 or 19 years. She had performed an incomplete abortion by taking in some pills. She had bad abdominal pains and she was consistently bleeding for 2 days. So I think it was just divine intervention that we had a pop-up clinic in that community during that time. And we're able to refer her to the reproductive health clinic we work with. We work with directly also with the Planned Parenthood Association of Ghana. We work with the youth wing there. So we have that direct relationship with them when it comes to that. So give or take, I just say that it's important to know that with these pop-up clinics, we try to have community buy-in by engaging key community stakeholders, the community leaders, so we ensure that our program approaches are culturally sensitive. And then we know that we form the foundation where we can share information and also build trust within the community. So basically that's it.
Yeah, thank you, Naa. I think she's overlapped a little bit, but I'll say it anyway. Never has to say things twice. But then on the question on how you can get involved with the work on the ground, if you're speaking in general, and if not specific to FHL, my answer would be to be interested and do your research on how you can engage. There are many opportunities and organizations that you can volunteer for, which can also help you to build knowledge and skills. There's FHL. There's also another NGO that I volunteer for called the ERA Initiative. There's AFRIAN, the African Youth Alliance Network, and PPAG, Ghana, UNFP, and so on and so forth. And also for engaging on the ground, you need to be sensitive to cultural factors and adapt to them in your action and advocacy. It's important to always have appropriate community entry to ensure buy-in and access to these communities, because Nani alluded to it a little bit, there's resistance. So when you have engagement from community leaders, it's easier to reach the people in the community. FHL specific, you can head over to our website, fhlgroupafrica.org, and sign up to be a volunteer and also read a bit about what we do. We're also open to funding opportunities. So if you know someone who is able to fund us or you want to fund us, we're welcome. We'll be welcome.
So easily. Yeah, I think Adoma, Adoma placed the link in there. I'll just reshare the link as well, just for those who would be interested.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh.
Okay, thank you so much. I don't know, I think after today I might start addressing you as twins. Since you guys, yeah, since you guys were basically sharing a presentation, and you guys were so good at it. Just a brief just briefly on what you've shared about comprehensive sexual education receiving negative feedback in Ghana. We have the same in Uganda, where the sexual education framework is not comprehensive. It is a values-based, so some of the items were left out. So I really understand what you're talking about. So it brought a lot of debates, and education has received a lot of negative feedback from the community in Uganda, and most of the people term it as being immoral. Yet this is the information that the young people want, and when they don't get it from the right sources, they're going to always get it from the wrong people, because there is information flowing all the time. All the time information is flowing. So that is why we need to capitalize so much on the comprehensive sexuality education. Yeah, I don't know if Ghana has a framework though. Do you guys have a framework?
Yes, we do.
You do have a framework. Oh.
And we are still developing, yeah. I mean,
It's
been reviewed because of the backlash. It's been reviewed, and we've actually been looking at terming it as reproductive health education. it's being contextualized. So that's what people need to understand, that comprehensive sexuality education in Brazil will have similar components, but it is not the same thing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So actually, in Uganda, it was launched and recalled back because of some of the items by the religious leaders. They thought that that information wasn't appropriate yet. They were the same people who were consulted when they were drafting the framework. So we have similar problems. Yeah, but I'm glad that you guys have it, and there are steps being taken to improve it. So
You just
Josh, I think you muted. We can't hear you,
oh,
Josh.
sorry.
There you go.
Sorry, I want to go to Laura, but the question is quite far. Let me just go to this. Just a minute. Please hang on a bit. I'm not seeing Laura's questions. You guys, please
You want me to
bear
jump
with
in,
me.
Josh?
Sure, please go ahead.
Okay.
I was trying to reach out and I wasn't seeing Laura's questions.
Yeah, Laura, often youth are more informed than adults about sex. So how can conversations around SRHR be held when there seems to be such a generational gap? And before you actually answer, let me say thank you to everybody that's staying on. We want to answer these questions. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And we still have a number of folks participating. So Laura, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you. So interesting the way the question is phrased, because it seems to imply that youth know more about sex or sex and sexuality. What I would say is that sometimes youth think they know more. And so sometimes they do. Sometimes they are more informed. Sometimes they've had more access to spaces where they can structurally learn, whereas, parents generationally may have been raised in a different context where sex was even more of a taboo and they didn't have access. So sometimes there really is an understanding gap. And other times it's just the confidence or the fact that the younger generations have had more experience in breaking those taboos because they might speak with friends more, or they might be accessing information more on social media. And a little side note there, that information may or may not be accurate, but at least it's out in the open and it's being discussed. So in terms of how do you bridge that gap, I would always revert back to acknowledging one's positionality is the technical word, acknowledging that, you have or haven't had access to sex ed, acknowledging that maybe when, if this is in the case of a parent, when they were being raised, maybe they were scolded for talking about it. And so for them, it's really difficult and uncomfortable to even start the conversations, or acknowledge, this is one of the top advice for parents having conversations with a lot younger kids, is acknowledge that they're scared to talk about these subjects with their kids because they're scared that it might turn them into more sexually active people, and they're not ready for that because as parents, one might want their kids to be young forever. And so acknowledging one's lenses as an adult is very important, and also as a young person, as an adolescent, as a pre-adolescent maybe. And this is something that we can benefit from in all areas of our life, not just sex ed conversations, but it's really expressing where you're coming from before you try to engage with someone that doesn't have the same opinion or the same positionality as you, so that you can acknowledge the differences and then move forward together through that awkwardness. Because a lot of times talking about sex can be really awkward. We're not used to it. So that would be kind of my main bit of advice on that.
Yes, thank you so much. I think my questions are back. Yeah. So another question to Laura. I don't know if you've addressed it clearly. Why do you think comprehensive sex education is a backseat in our modern curriculum?
Why does comprehensive sexuality education take a backseat in modern curricula? I think it really depends on what country, what school system, what system overall, what political system we're talking about. There can be so many factors. But I think without taking up too much time, I would say that the main reason why, in my experience, school teachers struggle to teach sex ed is when they have not been trained. Oftentimes teachers in, biology class, they've studied biology. And yes, that includes sex. That includes one aspect of sex that may not include everything that is involved in comprehensive sexuality education, which is far more social and linked to religion and values, and it's so much wider. And so when we don't equip our teachers in the formal school system to have these conversations, then, between choosing a lesson plan on, I don't know, how cells work and how pregnancy works, they're probably going to go down the cell route, down the thing that they're more comfortable with, because that's more, they can avoid it, difficult conversations that they're not ready for more. And so I think that if we want to change that narrative, we need to either be thinking about outsourcing sexuality education to professionals that come in as an outside source into the classroom, obviously working with a teacher that is familiar with the students, and together jointly offering, the information in a safe way. Or we need to be thinking about training our staff to have that conversation in a school setting. If this is the formal school system, that's what my advice would be.
Okay, thank you so much, Laura. Something just highlighting briefly on what you've mentioned. There was a program, I think it ended in 2020. It ran for 5 years in the eastern parts of Uganda, and it had a lot of partners who are working around sexual education. Just a reminder, in Uganda, I don't call it comprehensive because of our values. Yeah, and one of the things that they did, I don't know, maybe you can think about it, they had something called the whole school approach. What they did, what was in the whole school approach was they would teach every school staff sexual education, the guy at the gate, the matron, the dormitory wardens, even if it's a teacher of an art subject, they would give them knowledge and a lot of information. They would be like trainer of trainees on sexual education. They did this because actually even the cooks in school, even the cleaners in school were all given knowledge on sexual education. They did this because they kind of did a survey and realized that these kids in school can approach anyone and ask them about something about their sexual health and things around that. So it worked because you would find the guy at the gate knows a thing or two. So in case a kid just approaches them and asks them, why am I bleeding right now, then the guy has enough information about menstrual health. Even when even the cooks, even the matrons, even the wardens in the dormitories. So I think you can think about it. It's called the whole school approach. In case there is any literature, I will be able to send it to you. But thank you so much. We'll have last Q&A going to Adoma from Center for Biological Diversity. Yes, Adoma, a question came in from one of the attendees, and they're asking, what do you think about the steady state economy? How does this fit with what you talked about? And also, I wanted to ask at once so that you can respond to them at once. I don't know what works for you. Can I ask one by one? Because you have two questions.
Sure. Yeah, that's cool.
Okay. I think you're noting them somewhere. Cool. Yeah. The first question is, what do you think about the steady state economy? How does this fit with what you talked about? And the second question is, a colleague has argued that it is easier to convince people in the US to have one less child than to convince them to drastically curtail consumption. Could you comment on this? A colleague has argued that it is easier to convince people in the US to have one less child than to convince them to drastically curtail consumption. Please comment on this. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay, I think both of these questions sort of center around what I was alluding to earlier about consumption as a system. To look at the first question, first and foremost, the center really considers the need for a transition away from our current endless growth economic system. And that endless growth economic system really is what drives our constant need to push consumption, our constant need to expand cities and sprawl, and really encouraging increased resource extraction, continued land transformation, continued biodiversity loss. And that endless growth economic model is often considered, or from the work that's being done and all the research that's coming out, it's largely unsustainable. And so what we advocate for at the center is a just transition away from this current endless growth capitalist model, whether it be through the recognition of a solidarity economy, a steady state economy, as you're saying here, or another economic system. There's a variety of terms that can be used, and we're still sort of workshopping to see which one feels right. But in a variety of these environmental activist spaces, there has been the recognition of the need for a transformation away from our current economy. And I think that really frames a lot of what I was talking about before, especially with respect to consumption in the quote unquote global north, where we have the pressure to consume, the pressure to continuously always be buying, the model that fast fashion and a variety of other online shopping resources are really framed around. The steady state economy would require really drastic change in how we consider consumption, but would ultimately be an economic system that would allow for a regenerative and more sustainably minded understanding of our human relationship with the environment. And so, yes, to sum that all up, hopefully this answers the question. It does align with the issue of consumption I was alluding to before. We're still working on the term we're using. So steady state economy is but one term in a larger system of terms. But yeah, and I can move on to this second question unless there's a follow-up there. But happy to move on. And yeah, I think also the pressures to consume are really what I think the second question about convincing people to have one less child is focused on. Of course, the center advocates for voluntary family planning, and that people should be able to choose if and when they want to have children, how many children they want to have, and the circumstances in which they want to have those children, if at all. And to think about it in terms of, specifically in the United States, the pressures and difficulties around having a child can often be thought of to be at odds with our models of growth. There's a larger cultural disconnect in how people conceptualize having kids. I think to clarify where I was going there, it might be easier to convince people to have one less child, because recognizing that there have been pretty large scale unmet needs for family planning in the United States. There is a rising cost of raising a child, and there are generally a variety of other factors that have not enabled people to make the choices and have the full autonomy in choosing the exact number of children that they want to have. So recognizing that there have been those external pressures, but also the difficulty in convincing people to curtail their consumption might also be aligned with the fact that fundamentally, a lot of our present endless growth economic system has been really defined on looking at citizens, not as citizens, but as consumers. And our economy is largely propped up by that pressure to continually consume. And so without changing the larger system of endless growth, convincing people to drastically change how they consume might be a little bit difficult, which is why I was sort of alluding to during my presentation for the need for both systemic and individual action. Yeah, I'm happy to go more in depth there, but yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Adoma. I've actually, each time I interact with someone or I listen to someone who stays in another country, I really find a huge difference. That is when I travel most times, I find a cultural shock. Like I get cultural shock because for us, it is so hard to convince someone to have one less child in Uganda because over time, it has always been a sign of prestige. So when men gather, they're always sharing how they have 7 kids and all that. Yeah, that is why for us it's so hard. However, but we are kind of facing the similar issues, sense of living, raising, also like issues of consumption and all that. But it's so hard to convince someone to have less kids. But we are working on it, and we are not going to give up the fight until we get there, because they believe that each child comes with a blessing. Even someone who can, you see, is not financially stable to look after kids, they end up giving birth to many of them, and then they start complaining, not knowing that there's an increase on a lot of things like the government sometimes cannot provide for everyone, right? Yeah. Thank you so much for the awesome presentation and the response to the.
Josh, is it time for us to chime in? Because I know we are a little drastically maybe over time now, but people have stuck with us. But should I conclude us, John?
Yeah, I was asking if panelists have anything to say, then I call you on. That's what I was heading to. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah, are there any final words?
Yeah, from the panelists, do you have anything to say? Any parting shots? Or we can just conclude and then we close.
Maybe I'll just take a stab to say thank you to everyone that joined us here today, especially to Adoma for inviting myself and Naa-Amy to speak on this webinar. Personally, it's been insightful for me doing the prep and the research to speak over here. I've learned a lot about climate change, which previously was not an area that I felt too confident about, but I think going on from here, I can speak a little to the issues. So that's good. And I just want to highlight that the need to be aware of how climate change intersects with a lot of these issues that we've brought up, especially with SRHR, which is our area of purview, and the need for us to be more intentional as we try to solve a lot of these, there's a term that comes up in my work a lot, wicked problems that the world is facing today. So just thank you to everyone, and let's keep the conversations going, and hopefully soon we'll be able to address all of these challenges. Thank you.
I will keep it really short and sweet and say that for those of us who have joined this conversation the first time around, I think it's just beginning. And for those of you that have already been part of this conversation for a longer time, then I think that hang in there, because we've got a ways to go until we solve it. But I think it's through spaces like these as well, especially when we look at how different areas intersect, that we're actually going to get the ball rolling quicker and better and move closer towards the solutions. So it was great being with you all today, and let's continue talking.
All right. So just as Abigail and Laura said, thank you for having us, everyone. I mean, I also learned a lot, and let's just keep the conversations going. And let's also know that, I mean, change begins with us. So let's also make personal, individual efforts to see how we can contribute to the change we want to see. So thank you. And special thanks to Adoma for inviting us. It was an insightful one.
Adoma, any last words from you before I?
Okay, sure. I was like, oh, is it my turn? Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much to all of my fellow panelists, and of course, Kelly and Suzanne and Josh, who really have been doing a lot of behind the scenes work. It's a big lift, but we made it work. Thank you to all of the participants who provided some really fascinating questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but I think my email was in the chat at some point, and I'm also happy to answer any questions and connect you to people who might have additional answers if you are interested in learning more. But thanks so much, and yeah.
Yeah, and I know a few have come in, and we talked about this beforehand, and we didn't even know we'd go this over, but there's going to be a survey that pops up at the end and an opportunity to ask further questions, and we said that we would respond to you that way. So if one of your questions didn't get answered, or you think of another question, when you close out, a survey will pop up, and you can put it there, and we will make sure to respond to you that way. Well, let me just in conclusion say that we've heard so much about these root causes of extinction, pollution, and climate change, knowing, as Adoma said, that they're the same forces of systemic oppression and the marginalization and exploitation of humans, right? So today we talked about multiple solutions that can help overcome these deeply ingrained systems. We talked about how people and the planet are interconnected, and serving one can serve the other. I think we are all on the same page there. So for me, this webinar has brought me hope that the youth of today will be leading us into a better tomorrow. So thank you all so much. And as Adoma said, I want to thank our moderator, Josh, with Transition Earth, and our panelists for today's presentations, and Fabi and Suzanne for helping with tech, and Adoma's being modest, but she did a lot of work to bring this together. And as we've said, this event is being recorded, and we're going to share it out with you afterwards in our respective newsletters, whether you're coming in through Transition Earth or the center. And please take that evaluation. It's going to help us bring you additional programming. So thank you all for attending, and have a wonderful rest of your day.